So here are my thoughts on The Boys Season 5, Episode 6. I'm not going to bury the lead here. This episode was decent-ish, but still nowhere near what I would have expected of the sixth of the final 8 episodes that we'll ever be getting from The Boys as a series. It's definitely better than episodes 2, 3, 4, and 5 were. It's definitely the best this season has delivered since episode 1. Unfortunately, that's not saying much, seeing as episode 1 was solid but far from perfect itself, while episodes 2 through 5 were a collective joke not worth the effort of laughter. I'll probably be doing a more in-depth video or more in-depth videos over the next few days, covering my more detailed feelings about the episode and everything that it did or did not accomplish, but as follows are my surface level thoughts after just finishing watching. First, it was a little puzzling how easily MM found the legend while he was hiding out under a new identity as a concession stand worker in a Vought-style movie theater. The show built up how impossible the legend was to track down earlier in the season, only to have the boys find him with no explanation as to how, despite being desperate fugitives themselves, might I add, just because the story needed them to do it. That plotline does, however, lead to an absolutely hilarious firecracker-themed send-up of that meme-worthy Nicole Kidman AMC promotional video, so it does deserve props for that. Second, I don't understand why the Deep is suddenly so in love with sea creatures again. A big part of his arc last season was getting over that foolishness and becoming a stone-cold killer and Homelander loyalist with an appetite for violence. At any rate, his whole oil spill subplot and its tie-in to his rivalry with Black Noir 2 leads to his killing Black Noir 2 in a scene that is as ridiculous as it is wasteful of a character death that really deserved more ceremony. But disappointment, I guess, is just par for the course for this season. But on that subject of the Deep's killing Noir, specifically by stabbing him to death after choking him out, Noir's dying that way made no sense. This scene got spoiled a week before it aired, and I was left scratching my head even then. Like, how is Noir even susceptible to knife wounds when he got shot 1,000,000 times last episode by a Gatling gun and bounced back without even a limp? How? Make it make sense. Third, the weakest and worst part of this episode is the Soldier Boy storyline. How Soldier Boy switches sides time and time again on what feels like a whim before landing like a flipped coin on Homelander. How this episode retcons Stormfront storyline to portray her as Soldier Boy's one true love, and his feelings for her as the motivating factor behind why Soldier Boy fights Bombsight and ultimately gives Homelander the V1. It is yet another ill-advised advertisement for the upcoming Vought Rising show. It has not been established in any meaningful way in the universe of The Boys before this episode. It feels like a butt pull, so it falls entirely flat in execution. You know what? I remember how Vought Rising was initially supposed, or at least suspected, to air before The Boys Season 5, and I wonder if the writers of The Boys Season 5 were planning for viewers to see Vought Rising before The Boys Season 5, because that's the only explanation that makes sense. Because half this season has basically been predicated upon stuff that would only matter to people who liked or at least watched Vought Rising. I have said this so many times now. It is rarely a good idea for a main storyline to start doing spin-offs before its own completion because of how often it leads to a dilution of the main storyline's brand. And The Boys Season 5 has basically been proving me right every week. One of this season's biggest problems, if not the biggest problem, is that it's not The Boys Season 5 so much as it is Vought Rising Season .5. Or if you want to be timeline technical, maybe Vought Rising as an epilogue. It's so busy trying to get viewers interested in silly Soldier Boy and a show we'll be getting next year that it basically forgot to wrap up its own narrative satisfactorily for its own main characters. And that problem crops up yet again in this episode because where Homelander's getting the V1 should feel like a wicked triumph and the kickoff to a darkest hour moment for the boys, its shine is tarnished by the lackluster way in which it happens. Fourth, hearing Sage tell the boys that she never lost track of them and could have killed them at any time and knew how to find them but left them alive to reproduce and release the virus, kinda sorta redeems that more ridiculous aspect of this season where the boys have, despite being fugitives from all forms of American law enforcement since episode 1, have been freely walking around and driving around in the open at will, knowing that Sage has been covering for them this whole time, including possibly hampering efforts by the government to locate them, does add some level of credibility to the fact that they've lasted this long from a narrative standpoint, though it does not take away from how they should have known better than to do it from a storytelling standpoint. And the writers are still not off the hook for writing them to be so foolish as to do it without knowing that Sage was secretly helping them. Besides which, Sage's reveal to them still comes across as yet another annoyingly tropey, genius bad guy could have killed the hero at any time, but didn't do it for whatever contrived reason moment. But it does make the overall plot feel a little more believable. But as far as goes Sage's general storyline this season, it was disappointing to the point of stupidity. This character, Sage, has been presented in story as a master thinker, strategist, and manipulator / predictor of human beings, but somehow conveniently cannot predict or manipulate Soldier Boy, and her conveniently inexplicable inability to do so results in Soldier Boy's giving Homelander the V1, which happens in part because Sage also conveniently seems unable to predict Homelander in this episode. And honestly, that would be just fine from a storytelling standpoint if The Boys were another show that built up a genius villain character like Sage as being smarter than everyone else but not infallible. That moment of undoing for Sage would probably feel like a cool twist in such a show. But for Sage, as presented in The Boys, who has been portrayed in The Boys from day one as someone who anticipates everything, it comes across as nothing but incompetent writing. Fifth, the O Father plotline felt more than a little weird. The idea that O Father has apparently decided to take Homelander as God just because Homelander will answer him, whereas he can't hear God himself answer when he tries praying to him, was frankly just nuts. So I guess by that logic, Charles Manson could be God in The Boys if Charles Manson were a powerful soup who listened when people spoke to him and who could occasionally grant people's requests. Yeah, this is just ridiculous at this point. The fact that there are actually people in the universe of The Boys who are legitimately trying to justify Homelander as God. Then again, I guess that's the point the writers are trying to make with their on-the-nose, Trump-bashing political commentary. Either way, this entire Homelander, Antichrist, God plotline has left a strange taste in my mouth since the beginning. It's coming across as weird and undercooked and borderline crazy now. Sixth and finally, tied for the weakest and worst part of this episode is the return of the eye-roll inducing bomb site plotline, which I think and hope reached its conclusion in this episode. Again, my biggest issue with this plotline, as it has been throughout this season, is how little it relates to the main story of the main characters of The Boys, who should be getting their grand payoffs by this point in the show's final season, and how much it relates to Vought Rising, a spin-off show that we won't even be seeing for another year. We learned through messy exposition dumps that Bombsight actually stole the compound V1 to give to his soup girlfriend Golden Geisha so that she can live forever alongside him, but that he's been holding on to it because Geisha refused to take it because she actually wants to die peacefully after living a fulfilled life. And for that matter, just as a little aside, I've got to wonder just how Bombsight even knew that giving Geisha the V1 wouldn't kill her or condemn her to a fate worse than death like it did for almost everyone else who took it. Like, I know she's already a soup, but there is no reason for him to categorically believe she'd survive V1. Same story for The Boys, really. How did they know that if they give V1 to Annie and Kimiko, the two of them would just become immortal with no adverse effects? The Boys have basically been taking it for granted all this time, but I don't think it's ever been established that best results are a foregone conclusion. I get that Homelander is insane enough to take the V1 and assume the risk because he wants to be immortal and because it's probably safe to say that someone with his level of power probably has a high likelihood of successfully assimilating V1. But making that kind of potentially deadly assumption seems a little out of character for Hughie and Frenchie, particularly when their whole plan is to save the lives of the women whom they love. Anyway, we learn through more messy exposition that Bombsight and Soldier Boy hate each other, which Sage manipulates to get Soldier Boy to fight Bombsight for the V1, which Sage expects Soldier Boy to be able to get from Bombsight and destroy due to Soldier Boy's superior strength, and the hatred that she spends this episode stoking in Soldier Boy for Homelander. The fight, which is admittedly pretty cool, feels like it's more so about the fact that Bombsight hates Soldier Boy over how Stormfront loved him more than Bombsight himself than anything else, which again just takes away from the moment itself because it is yet another Vought Rising tie-in that makes no sense because that show hasn't dropped yet. Anyway, that's about it for my thoughts on this episode. It was decent. It was the best one since season 5's premiere, but that's not saying much. This season has quite a bit of ground to make up in its last 2 episodes, and I don't really expect at this point that it's going to land effectively in the finale, especially when the writers are already tossing self-referential jokes into the show itself about how the finale will not please everyone, and especially when the show's creator is saying the same thing publicly, like they're already just gearing up to excuse their poor writing to the audience as soon as the finale does indeed flop. But as always, that's just my opinion. Let me know yours.